Welcome, Iain McGilchrist. I'm very grateful for having you here with us. I suppose that everyone knows your work and also part of your background. You're a psychiatrist, writer, lecturer. You were a former Oxford literary scholar. You are a psychiatrist, and you got quite a prominence by your first book, at least, a book that got attention worldwide, The Master and His Emissary, where you discussed in a new way the divided brain, the making of the Western world. And since a couple of years now, there's a second huge book out called The Matter of Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. And familiarizing myself a little bit with your work, I got the impression that also your biography with literacy, poetry on one hand, and psychiatry and science on the other hand, has a lot to do with the hemispheres, as you are describing it. And what I'm very intrigued by is also that you're suggesting that our Western culture is very much lacking something, and it has to do with a reductionism that is, in your perspective, also related to your understanding of the hemispheres of the brain. And this is where we would like to go into today. We, of course, can only cover a small fraction of your work, but we want to focus on something that we call the brain, the sacred and the soul. And I want to say more later why we want to go in this direction. Before we do that, I would like, though, for all of us to have a couple of minutes, kind of 3-4 minutes, where I would invite you to go in a small group, in fact, a group of 2 in Diaz, where you just can come together with one another and just introduce each other, and maybe share shortly why you're here, what brought you here. So just to also break the glass ceiling of the screen a little bit and bring us closer to each other, I would like you to just join one another in this small breakout group. That's one of these beautiful features of Zoom, that we can do this just with a click. And let's do this for 3-4 minutes and then come back here for the conversation with Iain McGilchrist. Marlene, can we do that?
Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry, I need another minute. Sorry.
Then while we are waiting here for the rooms to open, also just take your time and arrive here in this shared space that we will spend together next 3 hours or so.
I'm ready now.
Cool. So let's open the rooms. By the way, Iain, I'm very inspired by one of the last talks I heard from you. I don't even know where I heard it, where the talk was from, where you very much also brought to the point the dialogue of the hemispheres as a form of dialogue. Because our work is also connected with the work of John Verweke and his Dialogos project. To see what you're suggesting is a intercultural dialogue that has really also a kind of a neuroscience foundation. It's deeper than it looks in the first glance when one just talks about the hemispheres of your brain. One doesn't see the depth of the culture in this.
I'm sorry, can I get with somebody else? My person kind of left. She's here, but she didn't join the room for somehow.
I guess let's just do it here, the six of us. Good to see you.
Very good to see everybody here. I'm very excited about this talk.
Me too. It's all good. This is just
I have a similar experience. My partner did not show up as well, so I could go with Olga somewhere if you want to do that.
It's okay. Let's stay here for the moment.
Okay, I can do that.
I'm back here because my partner was neither visible nor audible. Okay. So
but we are visible and audible here. Okay. What brought you here, Vera?
I'm working together with a consultancy who's helping businesses and organizations to develop towards sustainability, but wants to go beyond sustainability, rather something like regenerative living and making business. And we are setting up courses now for the inner work.
Everyone is back yet? Yes, we need a couple of seconds. Now here we go.
That's more like it. I wondered what had happened to die berühmte deutsche Pünktlichkeit, but anyway, now it's being demonstrated.
Demonstrated, the myths all around. Jan, your work is very much focused and founded on the understanding of the hemispheres of the brain. And I think in your first book, The Master and the Emissary, you created also a kind of an image that is very helpful and that I understand also being a foundational message of yours, that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and I'm sure you will say more of what this is about and also what this is not, that they are working together in a certain way, and that our culture is maybe locked in by something that is more, it's easier to understand if you understand also what the different hemispheres of the brain are for and how this developed in not only human evolution, but the evolution of life. If I ask it, you would just...
Yes. Well, I see my work as essentially philosophy rather than something about the brain. But I think the divorce between philosophy and science has been a disaster for both parties. And I want to try and bring them together a bit in a way that I think could be helpful. Just a little bit about my my progress or lack of it. I started off wanting to study philosophy and theology at university. I thought I would probably be ordained and go into a monastic order. But I discovered during the 3 years I was at Oxford that I wasn't a very good candidate for this life. It wouldn't have been good for me, and it wouldn't have been good for the monastery. So that was ditched, and I got a fellowship which allowed me to explore all sorts of things. And I had a problem about the academic study of literature, because people took something that somebody had written in the past that had great meaning, and they had left it for us to communicate something to us, and instead we sat in a seminar room and took it apart. It had its value because it was unique. Its message was embodied and also implicit, not explicit. When you made it explicit, you lost the point completely, like explaining a joke. And in the seminar room, we turned this implicit, embodied, unique thing into something that was explicit, disembodied, and with a message you could find anywhere. And that led me to write my first book against criticism. And I decided that what I needed to do was to find out more about the mind-body problem, because it seemed to me we were just too disembodied. I spent a lot of time in philosophy seminars on the mind-body problem, but it just seemed to me that the philosophers were far too disembodied in their approach. And around that time, Oliver Sacks had written a book called Awakenings, which I thought was very important. And he did two very, very wonderful things there. He went into individual cases in great detail in order to show general points. This is a Goethean phenomenon. Goethe, one of Goethe's most important philosophical contributions is the idea that you don't find the general by turning your back on the particular or the individual, but by going deeper into the particular and the individual. And he also seemed to me to be talking about what happened when the mind and body interacted in an odd way, and something happened to the body and it changed the mind, or something happened in the mind and it had effects on the body. And the only way to know more about this was to study medicine, and so I did. And when I had qualified in medicine and was working at the Maudsley Hospital in London, which is probably the foremost psychiatric hospital in Britain, I heard a lecture one day by a colleague who'd been studying the right hemisphere of the brain. It had never been my intention to study it, but he had done what lots of neurologists hadn't done, which is to sit at the bedside of people who had had strokes, tumors, or other injuries to the right hemisphere of the brain, and discovered that actually the consequences of this were more devastating for their ability to understand themselves, the world, or what was going on around them, than a left hemisphere stroke, even though the left hemisphere stroke most commonly made it difficult for them to use their right hand, to write, and to use language. So this was fascinating. And he told me in this lecture certain things which were based on a book which was published by Oxford University Press called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. He told me certain things that explained something to me, that the right hemisphere alone really understands the unique case, that the left hemisphere has already taken whatever it is and put it into a category, put it into a box, made it a representative of something rather than something unique in its own right. Also, that the right hemisphere understood implicit meaning, irony, humor, metaphor, poetry, ritual, body language, facial expressions, the tone of voice. But the left hemisphere didn't. It was more like a computer taking a syntax, a book of syntax rules and semantics, a dictionary, and working out what people meant. And the third thing was that the right hemisphere was much more in touch with the body. The left hemisphere was effectively less so. I have to cut corners here enormously, but just to give you an idea, which I think helps explain why I ended up in this area. And so I went up to him afterwards and said, this is very interesting. And I told him about the book I'd written about the philosophy of literature, and he wanted to read that. And that started a working relationship in which we researched hemisphere differences together. And I knew very, very well that this was a very risky thing to do. But I've got a perverse streak in me that if I think there's something here that's really important, I'm not put off by by people who say, "Oh, that's all rubbish." The thing about their brain hemispheres, it's all been exploded. It's all nonsense. It's all pop psychology. Everyone warned me, don't go into this. But of course, it was true that what we then believed was wrong, but it didn't mean that there were no differences. And the differences were fascinating. And it was the next 20 years of research, including neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins and acquainting myself with the literature and examining patients, that led me to understand these hemisphere differences. And so they come in, as it were, as an adjunct to a philosophical question about how we see the world. And what are the effective differences? I can put this as quickly as I can. For reasons of survival, all living creatures have to do two incompatible things at once. They have to be able to focus their attention on a detail so as to get it and grab it and eat it or pick it up and use it faster than anyone else, accurately, and so that a very clearly targeted narrow beam of attention needs to be paid. But if that's the only attention you pay, then you don't see the predators, you don't see your kin, your conspecifics, you just don't understand where you are, and you will not survive. So all the neural networks that we know, all the creatures, not just humans, but all the way down through mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds, insects, everything that we know seem to have at least two centers of attention dedicated to these two differences. And we think this goes back very anciently from examining fossils of trilobites. And the most ancient living creature still extant, a sea anemone called Nematostella vectensis, was described by Thomas Holstein in Heidelberg. And he calls this neural network the origin of the mammalian, the vertebrate brain. And it's already asymmetrical. So there's something very, very important about different attention. And effectively, if you pay attention to the world in one way, you will see one thing. If you pay a different kind of attention, you will see another. One of the things I would say is that attention changes the world. It actually makes the world that we experience, the only world we can possibly know, different. And it also makes us different, because if we pay a certain kind of attention, we can become alienated from the world, or we can become connected with the world, for a start. What do these two kinds of attention result in phenomenological terms? Well, the left hemisphere's attention builds up a picture of a world that is made of isolated fragments that have no context and don't mean anything until they're put together by us. We arrange them, and we probably put them in a little category. The left hemisphere is very keen on putting things in a little box where they all belong together. And so you have a world which is simply made of fragments. The fragments are static. They're frozen by this Gorgon-like stare of the left hemisphere to capture it. And they have no particular meaning for us. We're not connected with them. We are very distant from these things because we're observing them and ready to attack them. And they have no sort of implicit meaning or connection with other things. Whereas the right hemisphere sees a world in which everything is flowing and changing all the time, in which everything is ultimately connected to everything else. Nothing is ever completely isolated. And that when you take something out of its context, you radically change what it is, completely change it. You can, in fact, reverse the sort of the take or the meaning or the impact of what it is you're looking at by decontextualizing it. Mm-hmm. And so these two ways of looking at the world are, in a way, both necessary. They both have a use, but they have contradictory effects. And what I began to see was that in the world that we live in, we only use the left hemisphere's kind of attention. Can I carry on to talk a bit about Louis Sass, and then I'll let you come in, Thomas?
Go ahead.
Yes. While I was in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins Hospital imaging brains and looking at the abnormal asymmetry in the brains of people with schizophrenia, there is a normal symmetry in the brain. That is absolutely normal. The brain is bigger at the front on the right, actually, and bigger at the back on the left. But in schizophrenia, it's often reversed or absent. And we think that is connected with the phenomena of the illness. And while I was there, I got a message from my colleague, John Cutting, to say there was a fascinating book that I must read, and I did. It's called Madness and Modernism by Louis Sass, S-A-S-S, a psychologist at Rutgers in New York. And what he showed was that in the modern period, people thought their poetry, their stories, their paintings above all, and even their music showed an aspect of something that was like what happens in schizophrenia. And in schizophrenia, the world makes no sense. Things are no longer coherent. And he points to about 25 different phenomena that are seen in schizophrenia, but are also replicated in the last 100 years of philosophy, literature, and art. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating. It's a brilliant book and very well written. It may sound rather glib, but it isn't. It's extremely thorough and well thought through. And I began to think, well, if that's happening now, we can't all be getting schizophrenia. But I had already discovered that people with schizophrenia are very like people with a left hemisphere that is in overdrive and a right hemisphere that is not functioning properly. And again, I haven't got time to go into that. But that led me to think what's happening now is that we are not listening to what our right hemisphere tells us, only what the left hemisphere tells us. And then I thought, well, maybe there were other times in history when the balance was better. And I found, in short, that 3 times over Western history, starting with the Greeks and working forwards to postmodernism, there have been 3 times when a flourishing society began to drift more and more to the take of the left hemisphere before collapsing. So that is quite relevant for us because I believe we're in that terminal phase now, unless we wake up and see what it is we're doing. It's not enough to have a list of things to do, because if we don't change our heart and our minds, if we don't change the whole way we look at the world, we can't survive. That in an incredibly brief and simple way is to try and explain why I think this subject is important.
I mean, the way you describe it, and also the way you describe it in your books, it really shows up how our technological relationship to reality, the way what we define as modernism, and also the kind of effectiveness of modernism and the particularity of modernism is very much related to the phenomenon that you're describing with the left hemisphere of the brain. And it's very interesting that all the values that we have in our modern, postmodern culture are very fixated on that one. And I guess what you're just saying right now, that our crisis is maybe related to the one-sidedness of our culture. And what is on the other side are things that are, I mean, it's not just poetry. I mean, poetry is a beautiful part of it. It is a kind of a capacity to see things in a more intuitive wholeness. What is the other side of this technological relationship to reality that you're describing, and that you're describing to the right hemisphere?
That's absolutely right. And the central thing is to do with values, because the value of the left hemisphere is in getting things, grabbing things, possessing things, having power over them, having control. And all the rest, it sees this tiny thing that's dedicated to something it already knows it wants. But all the rest, the uncommitted attention to the whole, is yielded by the right hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes put it like this, that the left hemisphere helps us apprehend the world, which is to angreifen, I suppose it would be, whereas the right hemisphere helps us to comprehend the world, which is really to hold it together. perhaps to begreifen, but it's a bit more than that. Zusammengreifen, I don't know if it exists, but there we are. And it's something like that. This is a difference between them in their values. And so there's something addictive about the left hemisphere because it gives you power, it gives you control. Technology is the tool of the left hemisphere. But the important thing about technology is it's neither good nor bad. It depends on the wisdom of the person who's wielding it. And wisdom is what we're leaving out of this picture. Mm-hmm. The right hemisphere is ignorant. The right hemisphere is wise and sees a lot. The left hemisphere is relatively ignorant. So it sees literally less than the right hemisphere, understands much less, and doesn't see the need for what the right hemisphere knows. Whereas the right hemisphere, seeing more, knows that its knowledge is limited and knows that it needs the left hemisphere. So they have an unfortunate inequality in which the one that should be in control is the one that the right hemisphere, the master, as I call it, the one can see where we need to go, that can exert wisdom. Instead, we're driven by the desire for stuff, for acquisition, for power, for control, which is the left hemisphere's raison d'être.
You made in the writing process of your last book, The Matter of Things, a very interesting decision, as far as I understand. I mean, just to say, this is a huge book. It has 1,400 pages. It's 3 volumes. It's an oeuvre, and a big part of the 3rd volume, you decided to write about the sacred. And as I heard, there were a couple or even many voices in your surrounding who basically strongly asked you not to do that, to not harm your own book, because they appreciate so much what you are trying to bring to the world, to not kind of endanger that by bringing this strange concept of the sacred into this book. And interestingly enough, you not only insisted, you made a big part of the book about that. So my question is, why? Why? I mean, obviously, to a degree, the critics were right. This is a dangerous move that you made. For all your credibility, particularly in Anglo-Saxon context, where talking about the sacred in a highly secular culture puts you immediately, nearly automatically outside the scientific community to even dare to talk about something like this. Why did you do that? And what is the importance of this?
Well, I did it because it might help if I just very, very briefly give some idea of where the book tends. Mm-hmm. So it begins in neuroscience, that's part 1. And the idea there is to show that the right hemisphere is more veridical, is more reliable than the left across the board, including depending on cognitive intelligence, IQ, as well as every other kind of understanding. And then in part 2, look at epistemology. How do we get a grasp of what is real? We need to use science, we need to use reason, we need to use intuition, and we need to use imagination. And we need to use all 4 of these, not just 1 or 2 of them, in order to understand something. So when it came to applying this in the last part of the book to ontology, so what is there in the cosmos? And I look at things like space and time and matter and consciousness and all those important things, but I also look at values. And one of the most important values is the sacred. And in the past, until probably about 170 years ago, 150 years ago, there was no particular divide between science and what we call science now, which was called natural philosophy, and religion, which is another kind of philosophy. There was no conflict between them whatever. As is well known, Newton thought that his greatest work was in the realm of theology, not in the realm of physics. So it's an interesting, there's some very good writing about this now, but it's an interesting artifact of our age that we believe that science and what we term religion, by which I mean everything that is immaterial and spiritual, including values, that these things are at war with one another. And this is what I wanted to achieve in this book, is to push back against reductive materialism, because a lot of people naively think that science has proved, or science tells us, that there is only matter and that everything can be broken down into parts and then we will understand it. But in fact, that's not true at all. Science, modern science, recent science, is based on excluding any consideration of anything other than matter, especially on excluding the possibility of there being purpose or consciousness or anything such as the sacred. So it hasn't proved that, it's excluded them from the word go. And then when it looks inside, it says, well, there's no evidence for these things. Well, of course there isn't, because it's completely cut it out of the picture that it's examining. And I wanted to push back against this and show that by steps, if you follow me through this book and you agree with me, and it's hard to disagree, I think, as many readers have found, that we do need all these aspects and that the right hemisphere is more, definitely more of a good guide to reality than the left hemisphere, then we can't hold to this very simple, I would say, bankrupt, morally bankrupt, mentally, intellectually bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt view of human beings and other living things as simply machines. It's a very crude model which has certain uses, because if you narrow your vision very much in a very complex organism to a tiny little part, then you can see a cause and effect chain and you can interfere in it. And that's what science does well. But it doesn't mean that the whole thing is just a machine. It is a complex organism, and an organism is not a machine, and complexity is not the same as complication. Complexity introduces a whole new philosophical view, which doesn't in any way rule out the consideration of things such as values, and particularly the sacred. So if I hadn't actually talked about the sacred, there would have been a hole in the most important place in this entire picture. There would have been a vacuum where there is something really important to be said. It would be the elephant in the room. And I believe it is the elephant in the room in many conversations we have nowadays. The spiritual is the thing we don't talk about, but which is central to our being, to our existence.
I mean, to my understanding, this is also a big part of this huge contribution of this book. And what I find so fascinating here is also on the performative side of what you're doing, meaning you do several things at the same time. You talk about something that is just purely scientific. You talk about the kind of the most scientific things one can talk about right now in our times, neuroscience. I mean, how there's either you go to nuclear science or you go to neuroscience. That's basically where science is right now. And you discuss something that is really hard empiric facts about how our brain are constructed. You cannot go more scientific than that. And then in this, you show that our brain, so our material matter up there, is somehow organized in a certain way, that there is a different phenomenon showing up. One, in your words, more about grabbing, and the other more about attention. Excuse me if I say it this way. I'm sure it's completely wrong. But there's something where all of a sudden, what you're finding in the material sphere of the brain has a deep cultural implication for how science and humanities work together. And all of a sudden, at least when I read it, I see a reflection of the right and the left hemisphere in science and humanities, and in kind of hard logical scientific works and meaning-making poetry, beauty. So this is all reflected in that, but it is a discussion that is based and comes from a scientific discussion, but it goes deeply into something that is really completely on the other side, talking about the sacred. And doing this, I think, is something that is so much needed in our culture right now. And you make a plea for that by talking about the findings of science. So there's something why I think this book is important, because it shows something on the foundation of science and coming to a dimension that we have completely lost.
Yes, what I want to just slightly tweak in what you have just said is I much as I have to resist all the bad old generalizations that were made about the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, because they're all wrong. You know, that the right hemisphere is airy-fairy and the left hemisphere is down to earth and reliable. It isn't at all. It's not unemotional either. It tends to get very angry very quickly. It jumps to conclusions. It's not at all reliable, actually, when you come to look at the neuroscience that we have now. But science is not just a left hemisphere thing. Science needs both hemispheres. And scientific procedures, the whole idea of sort of following doggedly a kind of series of steps, is very left hemisphere. But I look in the book at the many, many, many stories of great scientists and great mathematicians, how they made their discovery. And they're all by having a moment of insight, what they call an aha moment, which is robustly associated with the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus. So both hemispheres contribute, but the right hemisphere contributes the bigger part. And the same is true of reason. We need more and better science, not less. We need science to be better by being less dogmatic, less willing to rule things out. It should be open-minded. That's the point of science. Test it until you find out more. And reason is also the fruit of both hemispheres. There needs to be a certain kind of mechanical rigor at times, but it must also be taken up into a humane context in which we bring together everything we know from experience, everything we know from our emotional and spiritual life, as well as our just manipulating logic, to be a reasonable person. And in German, I believe you distinguish between Vernunft and Verstand. And I suppose that what I'm talking about here is the sort of rounded business of Vernunft compared with the more abstract idea of Verstand. I may have got that wrong, but I think that's what I mean. So these also require both hemispheres to work. And there should be no surprise that science can help illuminate the sacred. And indeed, the sacred might actually one day be allowed to illuminate some things that we now beginning to understand that are very puzzling about the brain. So that's really the point, is that I'm trying to get us out of a certain mindset which is oversimplified and destructive to us personally in our individual lives, destructive to our society, and destructive to the planet. So, you know, it's an important message, I believe, and it's, as you say, it's grounded in so much neuroscience. I mean, I quote 5,600 different papers, which is why the bibliography is so long. So nobody can say to me, "Oh, you didn't look at this. Oh, you just picked this one and that one." No, I didn't. I spent 30 years looking at this literature. So there we are. Yes, I think this, at the end of the day, this spiritual aspect is extremely important. And what I'm suggesting is the left hemisphere cannot be relied on to understand it. What it will tend to do, because it likes simple positions and extreme positions, it will tend to adopt fundamentalist positions. It's all here in a book. It's black and white. It's written down, and this is right, and you are wrong, and so on. This is the way the left hemisphere thinks. It's either or. It's black and white. Whereas the right hemisphere understands nuance. It understands shades of meaning. It understands implicit things that can only be communicated implicitly, and the divine can only be communicated implicitly through a life, through acts of worship, ritual, through poetry, and above all through music, which I think is a very powerful source of acquaintance with the divine. So it's these things that speak. And what I dared to do was to write a chapter which is, yes, 104 pages or something, but in which I tried to be true to the spiritual life. I tried not to travesty it, not to diminish it, not to get it wrong. And I sweated blood over it. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm very pleased that I did, because almost nobody has said to me, as everyone predicted, oh, but the book's worthless because it's got a chapter on the sacred.
There is a phrase that you also use very often. You just used it right now. It's the differentiation between the implicit and the explicit. And it seems like a harmless phrase to look at something explicit and to look something implicit. But as I understand you, when you bring this in, you mean something very profound. You mean something very profound also in that way, at least how I understand you, that there are things that have to live in the implicit. If you try to make it explicit, you, excuse my words, you kill it.
Yes.
And it seems somehow also related to the spiritual sphere, that our kind of way of trying to get explicit about something is basically against the nature of what we are pursuing there. That there is the necessity to allow the implicit to be implicit, and poetry does that. I mean, the way poetry talks is basically opening up spheres of things that are not made explicit, but they're coming to the space in the way you put language. Is this relationship between something very concrete, explicit, that the left hemisphere is so good in, and something where intuition and also the honoring of the implicit, also the place where something sacred can come in, or let's, if we avoid the word sacred, awe and wonder can come in the way we relate to life?
Yes, our desire to know it all, which is what happens when you don't know very much. You think you know it all, but as you actually get to learn more and more, you realize how little you do know. That drives out the place for awe and wonder. We're so busy congratulating ourselves on being clever that we don't have the time to be present before the world and realize how awe-inspiring it is. What an extraordinary thing it is. And great art is like this too. It inspires awe in us. It's got nothing to do with feeling abased in some way. It's at the same time a realization of one's limits, but a sense of being part of something much greater that is unlimited. So it both lifts you up and makes you aware of your own limitations. And the explicit is never the same as, if you try to say, what does a piece of music convey? You've got about 6 words you can go, well, it's sorrowful, it's joyful, it's, whatever. But this will never do for the experience. And you can take a poem, you can take Hölderlin's poem Hyperion, and say, what does it mean? Well, it means it's all very well for a god. A god's in heaven and is exempt from all the things that go on down here for poor human beings. Yes, but when you read the poem, you have a completely different feeling about it, Doch uns ist gegeben, auf keine Stätte zu ruhen. Es schwindet, es fallet, I can't remember now, es schwindet, es fallen die leidenden Menschen, es schwinden, es fallen die leidenden Menschen, Blindlings von einer Jahre zum anderen, Blindlings von jahrlang ins Ungewisse hinab. It's absolutely wonderful. It makes the hair on your neck stand up. But you can't, when you translated it, it's nothing. And so implicit meaning is important, and it's also implicit in physics. It's not just in literature or something like that. You may know David Bohm, the physicist, wrote a book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And what he was really talking about there is the different nature of something that is implicit and something that is whole and complete. And that's important there. But it was also important in the writings of Nicholas of Cusa, Cusanus, or Cusanus as we call him, where he talked about the whole business of knowledge as being that first of all there is an implicatio, it's folded in, and then our understanding does an explicatio, but later there is a complicatio in which the thing is embraced and the two are brought together. This is exactly like the way in which the hemispheres work together at their best. The left does its work and the right takes that back and unites them, because the right knows it needs what the left has given. If I may give an example from music, if you want to play a piece of music, initially you are attracted to it as a whole. That is the right hemisphere's initial take on things. And we know that literally the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that takes that first preconceptual take on whatever it is we're experiencing. And then you have to go to the left hemisphere world and take it apart and practice that difficult passage at bar 20 or whatever it is, and you understand the way in which it moves harmonically back to the tonic and so on. But then when you go on stage to play it, you must forget all of that. It's not that it's not important, it had its importance, but it needs to be taken up and re-unfolded. And what we're doing as a society is we're taking things as far as the intermediate stage in which the left hemisphere takes everything apart, and we're not taking it back again and seeing how it coheres as a whole. So that, you know, the left hemisphere is left with lots of bits on the floor. Like if you have a motorbike and you take apart the bits and put them on the floor in the garage, you go, well, I don't know where any of this goes or what it does. That's the world we now live in.
I mean, one way to talk about our world is also to say it's gotten soulless. It has we lost the soul. And
yes,
I mean, there are also very romantic ways to talk about this, and also the word soul can be very romanticized in a sentimental way of understanding soul. Soul seems to be an important work also in your understanding of this and in the cultural analysis of this, and it seems to have a relationship also to the sacred. Why is this word important, and how is it important for you in this?
Well, I was going to ask people when they have their breakout actually to talk about whether there is a role for the word soul, whether there is meaning in the word soul, and that if we don't include it in our discourse, whether we're missing something, because there is an argument that really is a facet of something else. Mm-hmm. But whatever you like to call it, there is an element in experience which simply can't be wholly comprehended by the other terms we have, like intellect and emotion. Mm-hmm. There is an aspect of us which requires another term. And that aspect of us is what I think I mean by the soul. But because it is very difficult to articulate, although not difficult at all to understand in experience, if you don't tell yourself it can't possibly be that there is such a thing, mm-hmm. It's because it's so difficult to articulate that it's going out of discourse now. But in the past, it would have been a very important part of our understanding of anything. And in other cultures all over the world, it's still a very important concept that may actually save us if we can rediscover it. That's what I would say.
But in your understanding of the if we might go there in the function of the brain, of how the left and the right hemisphere relates to reality, how would that relate to something like being soulful? How does this come in there?
Well, as with absolutely everything, the spiritual realm has its left hemisphere components and its right hemisphere components. But I think the balance is very much stronger towards the right hemisphere, and there's a certain amount of hard neuroscience suggesting that areas in the right hemisphere actually enlarge and become more functional through processes such as mindfulness meditation. But I think that what I'm suggesting there is something that will never be grasped if you think it's a thing, The left hemisphere has a world of things, which is why the title of my new book, it's a pun in English, The Matter with Things. In English, we say, what is the matter? So I'm saying there's something wrong. I'm saying it's to do with matter, and I'm saying it's to do with our obsession with things. In the book, I suggest that there are relationships prior to things, and that everything is in process. So this gives a concept of a world which is importantly interconnected with itself, richly, complexly, and constantly moving and resonating. And that is a quite different one from this world made up of building blocks. Now, if you think that the soul is a thing, or you think that God is, however marvelous, still at the end of it, a thing of just of a very grand kind, you'll never understand what's being talked about. If you think that it should be expressible in language, and that if it can't be reduced to everyday language, it doesn't exist, then you will not have a chance to get near to what this is. And what I'm suggesting is the left hemisphere's take on the world is so narrow, so restrictive, so simple-minded, that it doesn't accept room for things that are complex, beyond language, but that nonetheless are very real and exist. So that's really my point, that the right hemisphere is set up to understand the implicit, the subtle, the interconnected, the contextual, the flowing, the processual, the related, the world of relationships. Whereas the left is for everything that is not like that. It is disconnected, abstract, and made up of things.
As you mentioned already, we want to use the seminar also to allow people to talk about your thoughts about the brain, the sacred, the soul, our culture, amongst themselves, so that we then come back also and allow this to talk further in the big circle. We have quite a lot of people here. We are more than 110 people. Before we go to these smaller groups, I would like to open the space a little bit here and give just a couple of voices a space to come with one or the other question for you from the talk that you have been giving, or the conversation that we are having, to see if there's one or the other question coming up. And I would encourage us to be very careful with the space. We find a lot of people, and just to see if we find a good way to do this together. And there's also Après Fournier from New York, who just raised his hand, and I will unmute yourself. Are you already unmuted? Please come forth, Après.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. McGilchrist, for your work. Immensely valuable and inspiring. I wanted to ask you, I would love to hear your thoughts about the neurodevelopment in cognitive sciences of the theories of embodiment that speak of the human mind as embodied, embedded in the world, inactive, extended, ecological, and many others, which instead of the thin classificatory dominance of science in the West, the global West, it's really a move toward embracing, in my view, the process ontology, a relational process ontology to address the mind. And I find this very exciting, and I wanted to see if you had thoughts on this movement.
If I may come in, Après, just before Jan, just also to keep the conversation in the context of our topic, is there a way, what you're asking is also in relationship to the theme that we, because there are so many aspects of.
Right. So I think the theme is what Dr. McGilchrist talked about, this thin classificatory dominance of the Western mind versus the relational process ontology approach to the mind. Yeah.
Yes. And thank you very much for raising that. I think it's a very hopeful sign that in the world of psychology, we've moved away from a more reductionist approach to one which, as you say, is open to, I won't repeat the aspects that you were describing. So I think that's great. The only thing is that while there are certain identifiable strands within the world of psychology that do that, most neuroscientists are so far from any philosophy and so far from any understanding of psychology that they just take it for granted that what they're dealing with is a kind of a machine. And if you say to them, well, actually, it's not like a machine, they look rather hurt and puzzled and don't know what you're talking about. So while it's very good that there are people who are taking the conversation in the right direction, as I believe and you believe, I think there's quite a long way to go, particularly with regards to neuroscience.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Anna, you're coming in from Malta here, please.
Hello. Well, I'm very honored to be here, actually. I am very fascinated by your books and by your ideas. And I have to say, I am a follower of Gurdjieff, and I was wondering if you know about Gurdjieff, because in actual fact, he's talking about the same thing, that we are seeing the word with the organ Gundapaffer, which he meant we're seeing the word upside down. And in his books, in his first books, Beelzebub Tales to his grandson, his aim is actually to destroy the way we think, we look at the words. And when I came across your books, I thought, this is Gurdjieff II, but you are much more clear than Gurdjieff ever was, actually. So I was just wondering if you know his books, because he's my teacher for 20 years now. So
that's very interesting.
Yeah, well, all I want to say is that your books and your ideas really resonate with Gurdjieff.
Right.
And
yes, I have to admit that although I know, of course, the name of Gurdjieff, and I have read short passages of his in anthologies for over a number of years, I've never actually sat down and read any of his books. But the fact that other people see these same things is wonderful, and just tells us that it is intuitively understandable without doing neuroscience, that we have different parts in us that have different aims and values. And this is something that is common throughout the world. So you find things very much like the mythology that I have created of the master and his emissary. It's a little story, a fable, but you find a story like this, not just, of course, in Goethe's Der Zauberlehrling, but you find it in China, in the Secret of the Golden Flower in the 9th century. You find it in the Vedanta. You find it very, very beautifully and complexly presented in the mythology of the Onondaga people, who are an Iroquois nation. And I tell their story of creation at the beginning of part 3 of the book, chapter 20, and it's extraordinary because it's so predictive of what we now know from neuroscience about these aspects of ourselves, how they are at war with one another but need to work together, how one of them has a rebellious spirit, the other one has a protecting spirit. And it's just unbelievable that without any of the science that we have to go on, these things are known to people and have been for thousands of years. So every resonance that I find, I just say, this is wonderful because it is another person who's in touch with this general philosophy. Thank you.
Well, if I can add something else, Gurdjieff, besides books, also taught movements, sacred dances, and he also produced music to have an impact on our higher feelings. He never actually used the word soul, but he talks about developing our being in actual fact.
Thank you.
So anyway, I just showed.
Yeah, thank you.
And Manuela, you wanted to come in.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Ian, for your work. I think this is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because it really helps to understand probably what a lot of people already felt, and you put it into words. The question I would like to pose is, because this is about the sacred, how can we bring the sacred back into the politics, like the policymakers? How can we help them understand that this is needed? So I understand, like, policy is left brain, everything really nitty gritty. How can we help them to see, to open up?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to show that intelligent people are willing to talk about these things, because at the moment there's a suspicion that if you have any time of day, as we would say, for the discussion of such things, you must be somehow mentally primitive. And I think exactly the opposite myself, but there we are. So I think it can happen. I haven't got a formula for how we can do it. You will be surprised to learn. But I do think that what we need is, as I say, a change of heart and a change of mind. And when people see this, see what it is that I think I'm pointing to, they often write to me and say, my work has become transformed by your thought. My marriage has been transformed by your thought, or whatever it is. So there's not a single thing that you can do, but there are ways in which if you change if you like, the spectacles through which you see the world, then automatically things begin to happen, to change. And I liken it a bit to, if you wanted to become a Buddhist and you went to see an old monk, a Buddhist monk, and said, I want to be a Buddhist, what do I do? He wouldn't say, well, first of all, you have to cut meat out of your diet, and then you have to sit on the floor for half an hour every day and meditate and so on. So it's not things that necessarily are actions to be done, but it's a change of mind and heart. And all I can say is that seems to happen. It seems already to be happening. This book's only been out for just over a year, so I'm very, very pleased. But I think there are lots of other people who can join this debate. I want more and more people to take what I've written and do other things with it, because I don't know all the things that are there. I'm only just putting forward my point of view. But when other people take this idea up, they will see all kinds of other things I can't see.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may add to this, Ian, you said that the book being out there had this effect on people. What are you observing there? What's the effect that your book is having on people, and why? What's the catalyst in this book?
Well, I'm just judging by my correspondence. I mean, people write to me, which is lovely, and although I haven't got time to reply to every message that's sent to me, but I read every message that's sent to me, and what I get is time and again two things being said. One is, somehow I knew this, but I hadn't any way of articulating it. And even very articulate people have said that. Today, I got a message from an editor of Nature, which is, I don't know if you know it in Germany, but it's often considered the most prestigious science magazine in the English-speaking world anyway. And he wrote and said, what I keep finding is that you have a knack of saying the things that I can't find the words for. So that's one reaction. And that changes things, because when people can see something argued for, explained, and articulable in words, they feel it's okay to believe these things. It's not so stupid to believe these things. And so that's the first thing. And the other one is that people say, it's having an effect on me. I see the world through different glasses. There's a very nice thing was said in the Guardian newspaper by Philip Pullman, who's an English novelist. I'm sure his novels are translated into German. And he said, when I first read The Master and His Emissary, it was like seeing a new color. I think that's so lovely that there's some other thing now in this world that helps me see something different. That's all I'm really saying, is I've got nothing else to judge by, except that a lot of people want now to involve me in their conversations. So I'm having a series of conversations. The first one is, I think, may have already gone up online, with a man I enormously admire, a very distinguished molecular biologist, Michael Levin at Tufts University in Boston. And the day before yesterday, a man from military intelligence came up here to consult on how to help the opinion makers, the generals who were involved in strategy formation, because he thought that if they understood what I was saying, they could break out of certain kinds of straitjackets they were in. And then a member of the government asked me to go on the radio and talk about things. I talked to novelists, I talked to psychiatrists, I talked to philosophers. What I'm really saying is the conversation is becoming suddenly very broad. And I think that is a very, very nice thing, obviously, because it means people are interested in. But I think it's the best I can do is to hope that people will engage in dialogue with me. You said dialogue is an important thing. And they don't have to agree with me, but at least to have a dialogue, because for far too long, certain subjects have been ruled out of the dialogue, and soul is one of them, for example. And the whole hemisphere thing. I mean, what a disaster. Now at last people are not saying, oh, well, not many, only people who are totally out of touch go around saying, oh, that's all pop psychology. I mean, they've got to listen now and do a little bit of thinking rather than just be dismissive. So that's also, things are shifting. Thank
you. Niels, you have your hand up.
Okay, good to see you, Iain, down here, fighting the fight for the good of mankind. I love that. I've been following you for some time now, but what is amazing to me is that I think I've always been spiritual. I go to church sometimes, but it's like there's been something greater and something very powerful in my life that has directed me. Whenever I had a problem, I could just say help, and boom, suddenly an image of something that resolves it just appears. Or a little word, just look at the nodes, it's one thing. It was a real tricky problem with in transportation modeling with all these pathways we can have. There are so many pathways that a supercomputer, it will take 3 billion years to get to an answer for that. And I won't bore you with that, but I think I found an algorithm that can do that in a fraction of a second, what it would take. So there we are, and that's computation. I think for me, the soul is the part of us which is connected to the greater things, which is God. We are all God's creations are. We are all part of that. And once you have that, then there are relationships, and God sees us all as the same in one dimension, a vertical dimension. That's the sonship. And the head of that sonship is Christ, God's original son. But so he was an archetype for that, and we are then created in the same image, which is mind. And mind is what is the thinking behind the spirit. The spirit is the unfolding, and the mind is the enfolding. That's my conclusion. And so yeah, I'll just stop here. I actually have an algorithm that can do both the left and the right. The algorithm is the same. In the left, it's sequential thinking. It goes in. So, I think there's a Danish philosopher called Søren Kierkegaard. He talked about we live forwards, but we understand backwards.
I talk
So
about that in the book.
And that is the right hemisphere.
Mm.
And that is
yes, of course.
And that is the
yeah.
other side of the coin of the same algorithm, so to speak.
The only things I would say are that I rigorously tried not to identify myself with any particular religious tradition, because I wanted to reach as broad a group of people, as open-minded a group of people as possible.
I agree with that.
And the other thing, which there's nothing wrong, of course, with that, and it's probably very good if people do belong to a certain tradition. I think that's the best way, but I just didn't want to go into all that. And the other thing is just to say that I don't think that anything that is intelligence is actually exhaustive computation. I don't think that's a sign of intelligence at all. I dispute the word artificial intelligence. I call it artificial information processing, as done by a machine, where it can do an incredible number of things very, very, very fast. But effectively is stupid. Only a very stupid person would even try to do that. Absolutely. Our brains are designed to do something completely different. So yeah. The other thing I'd say is that the other thing I'd say is that in German, the word Geist, as I understand it, sort of spans intellect and spirit, which is rather a nice thing. And of course, the Seele, which is another matter. Yeah.
Thank you. Todd, you also wanted to come in.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. I do think the word that is most operative in all these things is the word soul. And it's fascinating the distinctions you make between the hemispheres, but I'm thinking of the soul being what subsumes both of those, and thinking of the empirical work done on NDEs and other mystical experiences. I have not gotten all the way to the last chapter, so may well you've addressed that in that, but I'm wondering, is your understanding of the physiological process, does it allow that leap then for the fusing of both of those in the soul level, which would be then, you know, the sort of the congregate of both? So just your thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Yes, I think the quickest way to say this is that, yes, it does heal them. And the healing is easy to do once the arrogance of the left hemisphere is deflected. It's really the story that Milton tells in Paradise Lost. Don't forget that Lucifer was the brightest of the angels, hence the name, and was therefore the emissary of God. But because he became vain and arrogant and selfish and greedy and jealous of the power of God, he ruined the creation that God had intended. So I think that these two things come together. As long as the left hemisphere understands that, in Einstein's word, it's a valuable servant. You know, it's not the master. It's when it tries to be the master. That's what you see in all these traditions that I've talked about. The same story, a usurping tyrant who doesn't understand what his superior, his master, understands, who thinks he knows everything, and through that misguided thought loses everything. So I think that if you think about the spiritual life, there is a role for each hemisphere, but it must always be that what the left hemisphere contributes is a part of what the right hemisphere understands. So there is a place, for example, for theology, which is often quite a left hemisphere business, but not always. But it has its place. But it must be within something that is greater and embraces paradox and the coincidence of opposites and many ideas that the left hemisphere finds does not compute.
If I again may come in here, Jan, and the way you always bring in how the left hemisphere has to play its role, and also you bring it in surprising way, because usually when we think about theology, we think about spirituality, we more think about what in this context would be called the right hemisphere. But basically the way you describe theology, I guess in contrast to spirituality, is kind of a left hemisphere dealing with spiritual question that brings it down to let's say facts into the particular. And your work having this impact that it has right now in our time, isn't that also kind of a dialogical intervention that you're doing? And somehow, excuse me if I bring it that way, but hearing about your biography and that you come basically from literature, and you come from what you call the humanities, and you have it seems a deep sense since your childhood. I heard you speaking about the impact of the chapel next to you, although you were brought up in a secular family. There was a chapel next to you, an Anglican chapel, and kind of the atmosphere and the singing and the prayer had an impact on your young life. And there's something in the way you developed your work coming from that and from literature, and then jumping into science and jumping into psychiatry and jumping into brain science, where you create a bridge in our culture in writing this, where things that usually are completely left out, either left behind, this is basically pre-modern stuff, or they go into kind of little strange new agey way, all of a sudden are based in something that, let's put it that science and modernism can accept, because it also accepts the role that this world has to play, but it opens it up to that. Is this the effect that you seem to have on people, and is that also basically what you try to do in culture with your book?
Well, I hope what you're pointing to is the reason I had to write such a very long book as The Matter with Things was that I wanted to cover a lot of ground, physics and neuroscience as well as philosophy. And because I think that without all these different parts, we're only seeing little bits and the picture breaks up. So this is how science is, but it doesn't have anything to do with the spiritual life, or this spiritual life has nothing to do with this kind of physics or philosophy. So I think that I wanted to bring them together. And I suppose that I would hope that my work is an instance of what I believe in, which is that the two hemispheres need to work together so that it has a broad imaginative structure, but there is also a mass of incredibly detailed science in there. I mean, it's a sort of left hemisphere gone mad process whereby I had to document absolutely everything that I was drawing on, because there would be skeptics and people would say, this can't be right, this can't be right. I need to chapter and verse. So from the very detailed up to the very large, they're held together, I think, in the structure that I've tried to create. So yeah, I hope that shows people an example of what it is that I think is helpful. Not that in order to see a big picture we have to neglect the nitty-gritty, not to neglect the importance of the details of what we think of as the objective science. We need to bring that together with and marry it with something else which is beyond it and greater than it, but which can use it and understand it and take it where it cannot go on its own.
Well, thank you. I know we have many more questions, but I also would like to go into our groups. And my question for you, Iain, you seemingly had a question in mind. Is it still the same question that you have in mind, or did you change? Or what should
I think it is
in relationship?
I think it is. Yeah. Is there still a role for the idea of the soul? Does this word have importance for us anymore? And just before we break up, because I'm so annoyed with myself, I'm getting too old and my memory is not as good as it used to be, but I mangled a very beautiful piece of German poetry earlier and it has come back to me and I just wanted to say it properly. It's the last stanza of Hyperion and it goes, Doch uns ist gegeben, auf keine Stätte zu ruhen. Es schwinden, es fallen die leidenden Menschen, blindlings von einer Stunde zur anderen, wie Wasser von Klippe zu Klippe geworfen, jahrelang ins Ungewisse hinab. I think that is devastatingly powerful, and it cannot be paraphrased or done any other way. I just wanted to set the record right, because I hate to mangle a work of art. But I'd like people to think about the soul and whether it has meaning. I think that actually that poem is one kind of an answer to that question, but let's leave that aside. All right.
Very much so. So, are we ready to be able to make groups?
Yes, we are.
Great. So we will make groups around 7, and we will do this for half an hour, and you will have timers so you can see in your group how much time you still have. And we do this for half an hour, and then we will come back and continue the conversation with Iain McGilchrist.
So enough wonder. And so if we can get that back into our lives, that's a very important thing, I think. So thank you very much, Patricia.
Anyone else? Yes, John.
Very hard to give a report back from the group because what we discussed was so wide-ranging and so rich. And I know that Iain, from listening to him, has a great sense of humor. And I was just thinking, though, that when you come to the word soul, it's just impossible to define. But taking a sort of a left brain, right brain approach to it, an analogy which has come to my mind is one of a stew, where you're putting in all the ingredients, where you put in the meat and you put in the garlic and the vegetables and the carrots and all the rest of it, all of which are pieces. They are things probably left-brained, but then you put it on the stove, and it comes and transforms into something else, which is something extremely rich and something that you can enjoy with friends, which I think is right-brained. Now, I think our discussion was something like that stew, that everybody in the group had a different take on the word soul, but it was all very relevant, and it was lovely. It was lovely to hear Lynn speaking about heart and the relationship between heart, mind, soul. David was speaking about the wholeness of the world, and the soul has been a unifying force, but we just couldn't tie it down because it's too rich. And I think that's the way our group felt about soul. And I say, my summary is that it's the stew which has transformed into something to be enjoyed. You know?
That's lovely. For two reasons. One is I would feel quite worried if you had pinned it down, and the other and the other is the stew metaphor, which actually was used by William Empson to talk about the way a work of art is, that you can find this in it and that in it and the other in it, but actually its quintessence is in the sort of juices that take part of the whole. And I think that's a good way to think about, or just an amusing and, yes, I think instructive metaphor for the relationships between parts and wholes. And I feel that another way of talking about what I'm discussing is the loss of a sense of the whole and the substitution of many, many parts.
Okay.
Bastian.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, first of all, really honored to be here, and I love your work really very, very much. I'm I was flabbergasted to see an English writer having these very profound philosophies. Where in my study, I did history and a bit of philosophy, but then I was very attracted to this German Nietzsche, Heidegger. And it is indeed, it is so obscure often, and you can point all these things with so much clarity, and I loved it. Yes, and also,
thank you.
Yeah, also in really how important this message is for the world, and how difficult it is to communicate, and that you're most of the time speechless, and at least someone has come to a kind of result to put it in a framework, in words. So that I first wanted to say. And second, I find it also, the question is, of course, to convey a bit the discussion in the group. And now we all in the group have just a feeling that the soul must have a place in the discussion. It is so logical. Now, I can't really tell in a short time now what everybody has said about it.
Of course.
But yesterday I was watching Carl Fristen and Mark Solms. I don't know if you know them.
I do.
Yes, I think so, yes. And they are now in a project, and they're very kind of cheerful and excited about that. They're really going to create conscious in a robotic machine, and they are talking about in a few years. Well, I don't believe it's true, but I also can't argue that it's never possible, that it will never happen. I always had a very strong take that it is totally impossible. But listening to them and how they talk about this, I see this interesting ideas. I think, Jesus, no. I got a little bit doubt from their talk. And my question is actually, imagine that this would be possible, that they create a robot with conscious. What would that say about the soul? Doesn't it matter? Is the soul still this profound thing that it always has been, or is it a degradation of the soul? How do you see this?
Well, very interesting. I don't know how Carl Fristen and Mark Solms will know if their robot has consciousness. All they can ever know is it behaves somewhat like a creature that we know that does have consciousness.
Well,
but they can't.
There's not a purely test that they take as for granted. So it should be, but it is a problem. But I have good ideas about it also. Yeah. Okay.
Well, it is a problem, I think, with the whole idea of the Turing test, which doesn't really tell us anything except that some form of approximation to human thinking has managed for a while to deceive people into thinking that they're talking with a human. But it doesn't actually go any way to answer the question of how one knows the interiority of anything, really. This machine they make, I don't know. I think if we could know, which we can't, so it's a counterfactual, that it did have consciousness, then we'd have to think differently about what it was. It's not impossible, I suppose. I mean, as I believe consciousness permeates the universe, then a certain way of aggregating things might produce a kind of consciousness. I imagine that's what they although I think Mark Solms believes that consciousness emerges because of the reticular activating system in the brainstem. And I don't take that view. I take the view that consciousness is, as I may have said, an ontological primitive and can't be derived from anything else. But Yes, that's the thing. We'll. I mean, it's the subject of many science fiction books. What do we do when we think that a robot actually has feelings? My own feeling is that the soul is something that can only exist if there is also a body and emotion. And a body is not a sort of dispensable, peculiar kind of carriage in which the soul gets conveyed around. It's part of what the soul is while it's in the body. So I want to suggest that the soul is not exhausted by the concept of its being in the body. In other words, it can exist outside of a body, but while it's in that body, its soulness is related to that body. Now, what it would mean for the soulness to be related to a lot of metal and chips, I just don't know. But my feeling is that whatever it is that we mean by soul would be unlikely. And as I say, it's unprovable. So it's I have a horrible feeling it's a fantasy of left hemisphere control. It's like Lucifer wanting to be God. This is an ancient trope, isn't it? That we will think that we can create a living being that is the equal of ourselves or something greater, and it makes me very uncomfortable. But thank you also for saying that an Englishman could actually have something interesting to say about philosophy. I feel exactly the same as you. Some people have said, I never understood Heidegger until I read you on Heidegger. And I thought, oh dear, I think I've probably done Heidegger a great disservice because he took immense pains to be incomprehensible on the, I think, perfectly reasonable basis that if you weren't puzzled, if you could too easily see your way to what it was he was saying, you wouldn't really see it at all. It's slightly like the difference between having to drive to a place yourself and being driven there. Being driven there, you sort of feel you know it, but it's when you actually have to drive it yourself that you really get to know that you know. So anyway, that's just a thought about that.
But let me take you up on that, Iain. Because of course, what you are describing and you bring Heidegger in your writings has a lot to do with Heidegger's criticism on the technicity of our culture.
Absolutely.
Versus what he calls Dasein, or in the later work, what he calls Ereignis, which I would very much relate to your understanding of soul. Let's put it that way. Heidegger would very much disagree with that. But isn't it that we are living in a time right now, and also because we just brought in the idea of machine soul, and just in these days, all of a sudden that there's a whole recognition with ChatGPT how artificial intelligence took another leap, that you can basically converse with artificial intelligence in a way that you can pass the test of becoming a doctor in America this way. So there's something happening where we are confronted with something that in your wording sounds extreme left hemispheric. The whole transhumanist vision has this kind of left hemisphere sphere, and in that sense the question, how can we balance that, or what is the balance of this, and does soul have a role to play in this? Seems to be culturally not a luxury question. It seems to be a tremendously important question for our culture.
Yes.
Isn't your work an attempt to respond to this?
Well, I would say yes, it is. Clearly, I think there are a couple of things about soul that aren't contained I mean, however good ChatGPT is, and as far as I can see, it produces very mediocre responses, perfectly passable, but utterly mediocre. But I mean, it's a question whether or not further technology will get beyond the mediocre. It might do, but it quite possibly won't. Because the mediocre is this mechanistic way of thinking, and it's this mediocre thinking that I think has taken over our society. I think we've lost the sparks of genius because now everything is reduced to fitting into a sort of program and fitting into a sort of bureaucratic schema. Die verwaltete Welt, you know, that is the one we live in now. It's administered, and that is in essence a mediocre world. I suppose there's that, and the other thing is that whatever the soul is, it has, I think, two qualities. One is the sense of a destiny. So it's not just rootless or pointless. It has a sense of a belonging somewhere. And it introduces that into our thinking about ourselves, which otherwise arbitrarily dismiss such an idea, because, as I say, science has decided at the start to rule out any talk about purpose or final causes, even though philosophers would say that that's an illogical step. So it has that concept, and the other concept it has is relationship. So when you mention doctors' training, I mean, of course, quite apart from the worry that in future people may be able to pass exams or become qualified in something that they understand nothing about because they've relied on something they can get off the internet, which is an endemic problem for education from school upwards now. The fact is it neglects that what a doctor is a relational being, not just a storehouse of data, and also an intuitive being. So I argue quite strongly in the book that the important professions that are now seeing people, I don't know if it's happening in Germany, but in Britain, there's a loss from all the professions. Doctors are leaving the profession. Nurses are leaving the profession. Teachers are leaving the profession. And I think the reason is because they've been reduced to ciphers in a machine. They have to obey an algorithm. They have to tick boxes. They have to fulfill bureaucratic needs. They have no autonomy. They have no creative role. Whereas, in my view, a good doctor is a very special thing, as a good teacher is. Not all teachers are good. Not all doctors are good. But when you find them, they're remarkable because they're able to make bridges of connection, to see the whole picture, and to create a relationship with the pupil or with the patient. And that is something that is born out of being a human being, leading a life with opposition, with difficulty, with suffering, with all the things that make us what we are. So this mix of things, this very rich confection, which, as I say, presents both opportunity and resistance, is part of that picture. And it can't be in any way substituted by a machine, I'm afraid. I also worry, incidentally, I don't want to take up too much time because I want people to have time to ask questions, but I do worry what will happen, which I think is quite likely quite soon, when we either run out of resources to make ever more complex and costly technological devices, or when there is civil disorder and law and order breakdown, which I think is very possible, or there is a war, such as we never thought we would see in Europe in our time, but there it is. What will happen to people when they're no longer able to rely on these effectively mindless computers they go to for all their understanding and all their intelligence? If it's not within them and doesn't come from out of them, what will we be like? We will be dehumanized. We are, in fact, being dehumanized. And Hannah Arendt is wonderful on this process because, of course, she saw what happened under totalitarianism. Anyway, that's enough to say for now. But
Helmut, you have your hands up.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You gave me very clear pictures of the two hemispheres, and I'm very thankful for that. But I'm wondering how the body is coming into your picture, because we are all sitting, we are all rationalizing, we are all on the left or right brain, and we are now discussing, but we are sitting, we are not moving. But if you marvel, for example, a sunset, or you're amazed by an atmosphere somewhere, you feel something, then you use the limbic system. And if you go a bit deeper with your feeling, you're sensing that there's a respiration. We call it in German Odem. Odem means there's a meaning, or the Greeks called it pneuma. And then when you go deeper into the body, then you come to the heart. And the Chinese, and the ancient Chinese philosophy, they said the heart is the emperor and the brain is the first minister. So the
Absolutely.
the heart is an important thing because it gives the rhythm, and the rhythm is open to the atmosphere and to your feelings. But when you go even deeper, then it's not the moving system and the heart. You feel that there's something inside, which is the intestine. And if you look into the intestine, we know now there are 10 times more bacteria, but human typic bacteria, which are human, completely human, 10 times more than we have cells. And these parts, they don't think, but they are the connection between the inner side and the outside world. And so if we want to talk what is outside, what is the environment, we have to have the whole body, and the two hemispheres, they are important, but they're only a tiny part of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Helmut.
Thank you very much. Just to offer a possible correction, I don't think it's 10 times as many. It's around the same number. It's something like 36 trillion, but it's very close to the number of cells we have in the body, one way or the other. But the body remains. What's interesting is that you don't automatically see the brain as being part of the body, which clearly it is. But you're entirely right to draw attention to the fact that there's very much more to our embodied existence than is at least encompassed by the brain itself. The gut, the human gut, has more neurons in it than the brain of a dog, and the dog is a pretty intelligent animal, and you can be pretty sure that not all those neurons are there just to help you evacuate your bowels. So, and when I was in medical school, there was an embarrassment about the heart, because the heart had a lot of nerves. Some of them are what doctors call efferent, which is fine. The brain was telling the heart something, but there were also a lot of afferent nerves, the heart telling the brain something. Why was that? And it was said it must be pain. And there are indeed C fibers, pain fibers that run from the heart to the brain, but there's also much else that's communicated from the heart. So I'm 100% agree with you that we think with our body, our memories are stored in the body. It's all one, if you like, and it's the compartmentalization, as you can imagine, that I'm opposed to. The other thing I suppose to say is that breath is a very important idea. There's a relation, isn't there, between odum and atem. Atem is in Sanskrit, isn't it? And in German, there's atmen, to breathe. So, and then there's ruach in Hebrew, which is the word for breath or soul. And all over we see these relationships. So there is a very deep connection between physical activity and our thinking. Even more so, there is a relationship between embodied involvement, moving in the world and engaging with the world, and cognition. It's a matter that was pointed out by Wittgenstein, that when he sits and thinks, he seems remote from the world in a way that he doesn't when he's actually acting in the world. So all of what you say, I really appreciate and agree with. I'm not in any way opposed to any of that. Yeah, no, I like very much what you had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And Gary.
I think Christy was before me.
Yeah, it's just because Christy was moving, I took you first.
Yes, sorry, I have to leave to pick up my son in a few minutes. I'm going to have to leave early, but it actually pertains to my question, which is, you know, I've come about this the same way. I've reached the same conclusion about what's going on, but I can't help but think like this gets perpetuated by our educational systems. So if you had any thoughts about, I mean, how would we start to change our educational systems to change the narrative, to change the brain, the way our brains, you know, operate? I just think we have to start soon at the level of children. And I'm at the point of even taking my child, he's 11, and I'm thinking of just taking him out. I don't think I can consciously participate in the education of my son in the way, and I think I'm going to have to do something different. So I just wondered if you had any ideas about, in general, what it does have to change with our education system. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, but because of your predicament and having to go to pick up your son,
I will carry my computer out the car. I will. You're fine. It's the way of the modern world. There are ways.
I know that's right, but I'll try to be to the point and brief. I mean, the first thing is to get away from the idea that education is about inserting information into a child. There's a certain amount of information that certainly needs to be imbibed, but it is about a relationship, as I've said, and that is very important. When I look back on my own education, that it was the relationship with certain people who were inspired teachers that made the difference to me and helped me understand why it was important to learn certain things. I think bringing back an emphasis on the humanities across the board is very important. One of the things that's happened to science is that anybody who was at school in Britain anyway until the 1960s would have had to have a broadish education which involved history, literature, probably learning French, for a lot of people learning Latin and so forth. So they had ways into the humanities and into cultural history, which were extremely important, and they've been lost, they've been devalued, and now we only, in the typical left hemisphere way, value utility, and unless we can see what exactly the utility is, we don't value it. But in fact, this is not the reason for studying the humanities, but they are very useful in the sense that without them we become diminished, rudderless, and effectively lose whatever it is education is supposed to be drawing out of us. I think it's got to be much more free thinking. It's too tramlined. There are far too many restrictions on what a teacher may talk about or all the rest. I think it should be an open house. I think children should be encouraged to think broadly, but that is not at all to say that we ease up on rigor. This is a thing that really worries me, is that people talking about education seem to think it would be marvelous if children were just allowed to sort of play all the time. And while play is a very important part of learning, I don't disagree with that at all. You only become creative, not by just thinking with nothing to work on, but by actually learning a lot of things. And it's quite good early on to be made to learn an enormous amount of things. At the time you don't understand why you're learning them, but my God, later you do, and you can draw on them and be truly creative. So I'm not pleading for expecting less of our children. I'm actually pleading for expecting more of them, stretching them. Children love being stretched, stretching them intellectually, challenging them, getting them to think freely, encouraging them to debate a position by taking something they believe in very strongly and arguing for it, and then being told to argue just as passionately against it. And I think that is a very good exercise, which was a very important part of my upbringing. And all these things, I think, would help us But at the moment, it's so dead. I mean, so much of teaching is so boring. So much maths teaching, so much physics teaching, particularly incredibly boring. I'm speaking partly about my own teaching. I mean, if I'd been told about indeterminacy and black holes and things that are philosophically interesting in physics, I'd have become a physicist. But because it was all about measuring dots on a piece of ticker tape rolled out by a trolley moving at a certain speed, I thought only an idiot would want to be involved in this. It's completely boring and mindless procedure. So, I mean, we need to get back to the inspirational side of these things. And as I keep saying, there is a right hemisphere aspect to science and maths, the beauty of these things and the imaginative power of them. And we need to rekindle all of that. That's my answer in brief, I think. I don't know what you think.
No, that's true. I just think it's going to be trickle down. You know, once we get the narrative of what's actually going on in the brain, it'll trickle down into education.
I hope so.
But for right now, I do too. I'll do everything I can. I mean, my passion is connecting science and spirituality. So, you know, we'll see what happens. But the dialogue, I just want to say before I go, I love that. What did you say? The dialogue intervention. What was the word that you used, Thomas, for dialogue intervention?
Dialogal intervention of
dialogue. I think that's perfect, because I think what happens is with conversations is what brings change. And so I love that word. I think you coined a new therapy for healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you so much. All right.
Gary, now it's your time.
Okay. Hi, Iain.
Hello, Gary.
So much to talk about, but I wanted to focus
we can't go on meeting like this.
Like exactly.
People will begin to talk.
Well, let's go back to Pari. I wonder if there's a way to conceptualize the human predicament that will lead us to some type of a pathway to hopefully a solution, or at least some kind of improvement, which is this idea that communicate. This is, whether you accept this or not, communication in its totality as what I would call semiosis, the process of communication, is primary throughout the natural world. And what is very special about the human being that has given us prominence and has given us dominion is our capacity to speak. The problem is, it's a two-edged sword, because while it gives us the capacity to speak and to engage in dialogue with other human beings, with our conspecifics, it puts distance between us and the rest of nature, because it's coming from that damn left side of the brain. Right? That idea that language in itself and in its inherent function separates. It nominalizes. It takes things apart. So the minute that you name something, it is this and it is not that. It is a process of separation. And while we need it to maintain our connection to each other and to coordinate our actions together as a civilization, we at the same time need to be cognizant of how it potentially suppresses the powers that we need intensively from the right hemisphere, which are those of imagination, of being able to think of things as they are not, those of creativity, because I think that all that we can conceptualize that is new and novel comes from the functions of our right hemisphere.
Thank you, Gary.
And I'm just wondering whether you would comment on that way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course, as you and I know, language is a very complex entity. And I think that one way of looking at it certainly is, as you have described it, as a sort of sundering element. But of course, it has the potential to be a connecting element as well. And it depends what kind of language we're talking about. The profoundly evocative multifarious meanings of poetic language, of language used in liturgy and so forth, has a different quality, which is to bind and bring us together. And there's some wonderful research that I relate in The Matter with Things on suppressing one hemisphere at a time and talking about language and the nature of language with the subject. And when people have the right hemisphere suppressed, they see language as entirely arbitrary and simply a set of symbols that represent things. They don't evoke them, or they don't have any of the being of those things. They just are, as Saussure taught us, arbitrary signs. But actually, there's another side to language, and if you suppress the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere sees that even the words have something of the quality of what they denote. So you couldn't possibly arbitrarily change the name of things. You know, when they ask them, could bread be called something else? They say, no, of course not. Bread's called bread because it's crusty and delicious, and you can eat it with pasta and so on. So in the left hemisphere, even things become merely representative tokens, and in the right hemisphere, even the representative tokens get taken back into the realm of things. I'm not using thing in the diminished sense of that word as just an object. I'm using it in terms of there is some concreteness to it, some actual experiential element there, as well as just the abstraction that a word can be. So I would say it can work either way, really.
Inguna.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask, we had very, very beautiful discussion and it helped a lot. And I still would like to ask about if we take word soul to our experience, and I'm mostly familiar with Buddhist views. And there is a deep inquiry. I'm not my thought, I'm not my emotions. There's nothing static. I flow all the time. But the same also with the body. Body is not the same what it was 5 minutes ago. And if everything changes, then what does not change? And if we say that soul, and I have a feeling in myself, yeah, that is connected to heart. And you said so beautifully, there is a sense of belonging, sense of relationship. But that's, it's very hard to pin that, of course, and we're talking about, we have to understand what we're talking about. What we have to put this word on it. But it's also has a little bit of a positive denomination, because it's soulful, soulmate, it's positive. And you have talked so much about being negative and positive both, Holding. So if soul is something which we transcend and which is something beyond everything that changes, then it immediately gets a positive kind of the weight goes towards a positive. And I'm lost in that. I would like to know how you experience, what is your sense of?
Well, I'm sure you don't think that I think there's something negative about the idea of the soul. That wasn't what you were intending. But no, I think it's a very valuable and positive conception. I mean, it's something that really answers to an aspect of experience for me that there are things that simply can't be summed up as either intellect or emotion. Emotion is much too limited a way of thinking about what the soul is. And I think that although it has elements of that in it, it doesn't deny emotion, it doesn't deny intellect, it absorbs them or subsumes them in some way. But it's something much more than that. And on your interesting point about the change and is the permanence, I mean, I think here of the idea of the river, which in which, you know, the soul is the water in the river. It's always moving. The water is moving. Is some water coming and other water going, or is the water just moving? Actually, you can look at it in two different ways, and the change that is in the flow of the river is what gives it permanence. And you're right to say that our bodies, as well as our souls, are like this. Our bodies seem to us to have a degree of permanence, and they clearly do. They don't last forever, but while they're there, it would be ridiculous to suggest that they were remade every minute, and they have a degree of permanence. But as Novalis said, our bodies are living rivers, and they are. The stuff is moving through them. But there is this lovely idea, which I associate with particularly Heraclitus, that he says that by changing, it remains the same. And the image of water was very important to him, the idea of the river, that everything flows. But in everything flowing, he is not saying that everything is impermanent. The flow may itself be the thing that has the permanence. And my own belief, for what it's worth, but this would take a very long time to unpack, is that the soul and what we mean by the divine is actually both permanent and changing, that it is in process, and yet that doesn't deny that it has persistent existence. So that's really, those are my brief reflections on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may connect to that and also bind it back to your specific work, because I understand that a lot of your motives, it's at least my interpretation, is also to bring back values in our modernist society that are tremendously lost. And you can frame it in different ways, but there's something where there's a deep meaning crisis, there's a deep nihilism, there's a materialist reductionism. And there are many people also talking about it over the eons. If I just, out of my own curiosity, being down, what do you think is your specific contribution to that, your work? Because there's something specific that you try to do in the context of all of this, where you do something that maybe others haven't done yet or are not doing, or doing something different. What do you think is the specifics of your contribution in this question?
On that question, I think what I'm aiming to help people see, as I see, that meaning and purpose are not absent at all. In fact, it's almost laughable the lengths with which people go in order to try and demonstrate that, for example, life exhibits no purpose and organisms have no purpose and so on. I don't believe this for an instant. And only heroic efforts of explaining away make it possible to maintain this kind of point of view. So I think that what is lacking is that the left hemisphere doesn't understand values, it denigrates values, and its only value, if you like, is that of utility or pleasure. And I'm very interested in the philosophy of Max Scheler, who, as you know, Heidegger gave the funeral oration. He died young and said that he was the most important philosopher of his generation. And I believe he was a very important philosopher, and that he brought a degree of of both emotion and morality into the world of Heidegger that sometimes seems to lack both. He had a pyramid of values, which I've referred to in both my books, and the bottom level is that of pleasure and utility, and that's the one that the left hemisphere understands. But the ones that come after that, it doesn't. On Scheler's thinking, the next tier above that is die Lebenswerte, things like bravery, magnanimity, fidelity, loyalty, courage and kindness and things like that. And then above that there come die geistige Werte, which I think are effectively the Platonic virtues of beauty, truth and goodness. And at the summit is das Heilige. And I think that we have, as I suggest, inverted this pyramid so that what should be at the top is actually at the bottom, and what should be at the bottom is exalted to the top. And the way that we see it from the left hemisphere's perspective is that all these other values are fictions which are created in order to drive utility and pleasure. That's a quite extraordinary idea, a very diminished one. So what I've tried to do is to reopen discussion about values, about the sacred and about purpose. Those are the last 3 chapters of my book. And I've prepared the way for that by doing the work on the neuroscience and the epistemology to show that it's not necessarily wise to rely on the left. In fact, it's necessarily unwise to rely on the left hemisphere's understanding of such things, which is what we now do.
Thank you. David, you have your hand up.
Well, thank you. Iain, I'm very encouraged by a lot that's been happening over the last, say, 25 or 30 years. Your own work, greatly part of it. Also, and the kind of neurophysiological investigation of meditative states, stuff like that. Why? Because you can approach that kind of investigation in one of 2 ways. Either I'm going to knock this stuff out and show it's complete nonsense, or there's something intriguing here. Now, it turned out there was something intriguing there, which is very encouraging.
Yeah.
The other thing, and it plays into this, is that all the great traditions have developed very, very highly technical terminology, which is difficult to translate between. If you take, say, a book on neurophysiology now, translate it into Sanskrit and give it to somebody a couple of thousand years back, what is this nonsense? But we're doing that to their sacred texts. And I think that if it comes to be seen that there is a genuine interplay between these viewpoints, there'll be a huge synergistic effect, and that our own understanding of ourselves will deepen. The other point is a very different one. The difference between, say, us and a, quote, artificial intelligence or artificial awareness. There's a great scene in, of all movies, Terminator 2, where the Terminator, I don't know if you know the movie. Okay. This robot goes back in time to protect somebody who needs to be protected in order for something to happen later on. It's an alternate reality thing. But the point is, the person being protected is about 12 or 13. He's a kid. The Terminator is a robot, right? And the point comes where there's some thugs attacking the kid. Not badly, but attacking him. The Terminator comes along and says, deals with them, and then turns to the kid, John, and says, I will kill them. And John says, no, you can't do that. And the Terminator just says one word, why? And John is stunned. It just hadn't occurred to him that you could even ask that question. And the rest of the movie, or a lot of it, is the interplay between these 2 very different beings, John, the kid growing up, and the Terminator who's sent to protect him, who comes to have some understanding of what it is to be human. So that might be what happens. You know, we create things. We create a new being every time we have children. Now, if we could simply synthesize, this is way down the timeline. If we could simply create a sperm synthetically and create an ovum synthetically, fuse them, what then? What do we say of the being that results from that? That's my question.
Yes, it's a counterfactual and impossible really to answer. When you say we make a new being, I would say a new being is made through our agency. So we don't know how the new beings that are people come about or what they are. In some ways, that's my central question. We misunderstand what a human being is. We misunderstand what we are and what this world is and what we're doing here. Those three questions seem to me terribly important. And no, I wouldn't disagree with your idea that some sort of synergy between different world pictures would be a very, very helpful one and a potentially very fruitful one. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for your work too.
If I just may take you on that one. When you say we misunderstand what a human being is, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, we've been fed what are, it's not too strong to say, a pack of lies. We've been peddled a myth of what a human being is, which is profoundly mistaken, that we are some kind of faulty machine, but we're not a machine at all, let alone a faulty one. It would be more sense to talk about machines as extremely faulty living beings, which they undoubtedly are. We've got the cart before the horse. We've inverted everything here. And we've got into a state of pessimism and about the degraded state of what we believe a human being to be. But I think it's important to rediscover the greatness that human beings can encompass in different ways in their lives. And I don't mean greatness necessarily in being famous and being a mover and shaker, but I just mean the spiritual stature of any potential human life. So I don't think we understand that. We think we're machines. We think it's about things. We think it's about acquisition. We think it's about possession. We don't see it's about relationship. And as I keep on saying, and it sounds simple to say, but it's actually a very important and deep thought that unpacks over 1,500 pages, that everything actually is relational and only exists relationally.
Niels.
Way to the next one. I've already been in, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello?
You're muted still.
Can't hear you.
Hello.
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 Hi. Hi, Dr. McGilchrist. Thank you so much.
Hello.
I have a question about the way in which we have spiritual experiences. I've been learning a lot about temporal lobe epilepsy. I have it, but also talk with a lot of people about it. And I'm wondering, sometimes it seems like there's this inhibition of the left. And so it like emboldens a sense of wonder and beauty and just this perfection of the world as it is. But I just read in The Matter with Things about you just mentioned the right temporal lobe seizures, and also how that can promote a certain sense of like well-being. So my question, could both of those things be happening for people? Like, can the left, like especially like with head trauma too, can the left side go offline and then can that strengthen the right?
Well, the relationship between the hemispheres is very complex, as I attempt to explain, and at times it is it is one of mutual inhibition. And so it was discovered by Brown-Séquard in the 1890s in the frog, that if you knocked out something on one side, you had a lesion, but if you knocked out the equivalent thing on the other side, sometimes there was a quick recovery of function. So they have obviously a relationship in which they cooperate, but they also have a relationship in which they compete. So that's partly the story. But the other thing that's really complicated about epilepsy is that epilepsy can quite clearly arise in an area where the underlying brain tissue is abnormal and therefore possibly not functioning in the way that it normally would. But so there might be a diminution of what is normally going on in that part of the brain. But there is also the possibility of a heightening of whatever it is that is underlying, because sometimes if the tissue is not dysfunctional, but there is greater excitation, which is what happens, of course, during a seizure, then there could be a strengthening or a sort of exaltation of whatever this experience was. So it's extremely difficult to talk about, but as you probably know, autoscopy, the out-of-body experience, is associated with right hemisphere either epilepsy or sometimes deficits. So it's a very, very complicated area, and it's thought that, as you know, that Saul, who became St. Paul, had an epileptic seizure when he was blinded and had that vision, which caused him to change his life. And Dostoevsky also had undoubtedly temporal lobe seizures, and which related to his sense of something very spiritual. So the brain is a sort of interface between who we are and these interesting experiences, and it's a mystery. I mean, I don't know what to say about it, except that, you know, it's a very complicated thing, and we can't either deny the part that the brain plays, or I think argue coherently that it's all a brain state. It can't be. I mean, consciousness is something other than what the brain as pure matter can possibly produce or even mediate for us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shannon. I take this also as a very good last statement for our 3 hours here together. I know we still have some hands up, but I think this is a good point to end. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you everyone for coming and for your interest in Iain McGilchrist's work.
Thomas, can you stay for a minute at the end?
Sure.
Okay. Yes. I'm a great believer in boundaries, but you persuade me. Anyway, I'd just like to say to all of you that I'm very grateful for your interest and for coming along and spending time this evening. So, and I send you all my heartfelt best wishes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.